Hello, everyone. So we are back with lesson 36, lecture 2, and we are picking up the story at where we stopped, which was the end of the good era of the five emperors at the time of Commodus. But before we actually move into the end of that good era and what that was like, I wanted to take a small detour to talk about something that I think is very essential to understanding second century Roman Empire, and that is a profound sense of cultural transformation that will lead to, among others, all those emperors having beards. Now, you might think like, what kind of profound cultural transformation leads to people having beards? And the short answer to that question is that the association of a beard, and even Commodus had one, although I don't think he quite subscribed to all parts of that, what we're going to talk about, it has an association of being a wise man or maybe even a philosopher, which doesn't so much mean a job description as it would mean today, say you are a professor in a philosophy department, but it would mean something like a deep investment in trying to figure out how to lead your life in the best way possible according to some philosophical principles. And so, in fact, one of the most striking aspects of second century Roman emperors after Trajan is that they all have beards and they all deeply engage with culture and think about sort of what is the best way to lead their lives. Now, as you might recall, we already started to talk about philosophical schools a little bit, and we talked about how in the late Republic, for example, Epicurean philosophy, which is another Hellenistic Greek philosophy, shaped contemporary thinking about how to lead one's life. And in order of frequency and preference, I think in the Roman Empire, of the three major schools that are sort of significant, there are some other groups of thinkers, but these are the three that are worth mentioning for us here. The Epicureans sort of fall back a little bit behind another school of thought, who are the Stoics. And there is also a third group of thinkers who follow a revival of Plato's philosophy, the classical Athenian philosopher. And we are not going to talk so much about that, but you might recall that we have mentioned occasionally a Greek writer who has written biographies of Greeks and Romans, Plutarch, and he would fall under the Middle Platonic group. Now, when we talked about Epicurean philosophy in the late Republic, what we were trying to understand, what are the main principles or ideas that shape the philosophy? And I think that one of the big distinctions that we made was that Epicurean today, when it's used sort of in the modern American talk, it often means someone who is really after pleasures, right? It's the goal of having the most fun possible. And I think that the distinction we made between the modern Epicureans and the ancient Epicureans had to do with the idea that the ancient Epicurean would think that modest pleasures are okay, but this is not about just having pleasures all the time. Because the worry would be that if you are just going after fun, that at some point you would get so attached to this idea of having fun all the time, and that would be, or whatever is that, if that's a lover or a food or money or whatever it is that you are thriving after, that it would interfere with the larger goal, which is to be free from fear and free from pain. Because as most of us know by experience, at some point in your life when you're pursuing any of those goals, you will have disappointments. And so the more invested you are in them, the less likely that you could be free from fear or pain. Now, the Stoics are also, after trying to understand how to lead a reasonably good life, but unlike the Epicurean name, which has such a big distinction between the ancient and the modern usage, the Stoics are still used today. If you go on Amazon, there are books today that people publish with Stoic philosophy in the title or subtitle. And this is still something that's very popular in a very similar way to how it was used in the ancient world. So unlike the Epicureans, difference between ancient and modern, the Stoic is kind of similar, how it's used in the past and how it's used in the present. And where the Stoics and the Epicureans would differ, although we will talk more about this, but a sort of good starting point is that what they would say is that life will bring you things that might seem to cause or want to cause you pleasure or pain. But as a Stoic, what you have to understand is that, you know, those pleasures and pains are most often that culture embraces as sort of painful or pleasurable is in fact something that you shouldn't be feeling so much pleasure and pain about. And your development is to understand that these things are only so important. So say the stock market crashes and, you know, you find yourself in financial trouble, they would say this is an external thing, you know, and as long as you have your mind and you have your settled shape, that's not such a big deal, or that's the goal. So in the Roman Empire, Stoic philosophy becomes incredibly popular, especially among the Roman elite. And one of the key figures you have already encountered, because he was Nero's teacher, and that is Seneca the Younger, who in one of his many works he has written, called Natural Questions, put it this way, and this is also on your handout. What is the principal thing? To be able to endure adversity with a joyful heart, to bear whatever betide, just as if it were the very thing you desired to have happen to you. For you would have felt it your duty to desire it had you known that all things happen by divine decree. Tears, complaints, lamentations are rebellion against divine order. So one of the things that you can start seeing here is this sense that there is a larger cosmic order, and that everything that happens, therefore, is somehow making sense in that larger order. And therefore, you throwing a hissy fit about it is something that would mean that you're revolting against this larger order. And another sort of aspect of this that also quite important is that you might recall that Seneca, of course, later in his life, after Nero is really has killed the mother and probably killed Burrus, we see that, you know, potentially being a member of the Roman elite in this period is not necessarily a great free thing. And I think it gives, for members of the Roman elite, Stoic philosophy allows them to have some sense of control, you know, some sense of, you know, I'm doing the right thing, you know, Nero, you do you, and I'm Seneca just doing what I think is right, and that's what I'm gonna do, and that's all I can do, right? Because I cannot control you, and I cannot control whatever you had planned for me. Now, I find that there is an interesting simile that sometimes they use in Stoic philosophy that is good for my students to conceptualize this, and that has to do with the archer. And the way Stoic philosophers would do it is a wise man is like an archer who cares less about actually hitting the target than about doing his best to hit it. Wisdom includes understanding the difference, right? So there is a lot of emphasis here on what you are trying to do. And, you know, like there are some things you cannot control. I think today we are keenly aware of this. But our goal is not necessarily to get the goal, but to do our best to reach the goal, right? It's a little bit similar. I'm sure that when you went to school, people were talking to you about sort of growth mindsets. And in fact, Stoic philosophy in this period will talk about, you know, the perfect wise men, but quite often they will also consider what it's like not to be quite there at the perfect. So they would say, like, you should keep trying. You should keep trying, right? That's the goal. Okay, so this is where my students now usually say, like, absolutely not. So let's see this next paragraph. So if a perfectly wise man saw his child in danger of drowning, he would try to save the child. So far, so good. But if he failed or succeeded, he would accept this without feeling distress or pity or pride or relief, and without his happiness being diminished or enhanced. Now, most of my students are like, fine, okay, don't throw like a freaking celebration if you saved your child from drowning. But what about if the child drowns? Most of us would think like, wow, that's a major, you know, problem, major loss. Of course, you would want to feel distress and pity. And the Stoics sort of advocate for that you shouldn't. Because again, there is this sense of the larger divine order. And there is one little trick with this, and I'm very interested in this subject, so I will have to sort of limit myself. But one aspect of this that's very interesting is that they figure out that at certain points you might have a first feeling about that. You know, something happens and you're like, oh shucks, or yay, or something like that. But what they want you to do is after that to go into your head and sort of realize that that has only so much import, and then sort of chill out and realize just, you know, at the end of the day, the kid is either alive or dead, and that's just what it is. I can't quite go all the way with them personally, but you can see how that works. So they are very much into sort of moral virtue, and they think a lot about sort of how the wise men can achieve it. And so this idea is ultimately that how to lead a good life is according to nature, which is again this sort of larger divine concept. The living according to nature means living according to reason, right? So you have to train your brain, and this is the highest principle of the human soul. And what your goal is in self-preserving is to perfect yourself, right? And the goal is to disregard things that are indifferent and over which you have no control: birth, beauty, better wealth, similar things. And they want you instead to focus on these virtues such as moral insight, courage, self-control, temperance, and justice. Now, all this takes a very interesting turn when we reach the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, because Marcus Aurelius, in fact, not only embraces this philosophical idea, you see he has the beard, but in fact he writes a work that's still frequently published today, often titled Meditations, but in fact in the original Greek that it was written in, it's called To Himself. So it's sort of his notes. Essentially it's thinking about philosophy as a way of life, right? Sort of not philosophy as like I'm in the philosophy department and that's what I do, but how to be this ideal wise man. And so the meditations are sort of a diary of a would-be Stoic sage at work on himself. The idea is that he keeps reminding himself, right? It's a practice. It's not like, okay, I have learned it now, can I take the final exam and be done with it? But it's something that you have to keep thinking about every day. And that's what he does in the meditations. And he is pretty harsh on himself sometimes. It's also like a trying to govern yourself type thing when he realizes that he is failing in some aspect, like he's not doing a great job. Now, if you can take a moment and look at the handout where I gave you 3 segments of Marcus's meditations. The first one is from Book 4, Section 32. And what's really interesting here is that he sort of looks back at other Roman emperors and thinks about sort of what that is like to be an emperor, right? Think about this as the most powerful person, right, in all of the Roman Empire. And this is when he's thinking back on other emperors. So 432, call to mind by way of example the time of Vespasian, you will see everything the same. Men marrying, bringing up children, falling ill, dying, fighting, feasting, trading, farming, flattering, asserting themselves, suspecting, plotting, praying for another's death, murmuring at the present, lusting, heaping up riches, setting their heart on offices and thrones. And now that life of theirs is no more and nowhere. Again, pass on to the time of Trajan. Again, everything the same. People thriving, farming, plotting. That life too is dead, right? And so what he says essentially, this is just what it is. We all like spending all our lives sort of thriving after things, and then we all just die, right? So that outcome is pretty sort of the same, right? So what matters really from life? And he even pushes this further in the next sentence, that when he thinks about all of history and all of nations and says, well, that's just what's coming. So that's kind of a little bit of a challenge, sort of the usually much more aggressive and victory-oriented Roman culture. And this is a guy who is working on this while he is on those campaigns against the various Germanic tribes in the front. So it's just really sort of almost like a weird contrast between those 2 things. Now, from the next section, 616, you can look at the very last sentence, as sort of what he is giving to himself as a guide. You should read the rest of it. He essentially is trying to talk himself out about feeling too excited about things that he shouldn't. And so he says, but to revere and value your own understanding will make you acceptable to yourself, harmonious with your fellows, and in concord with the gods, that is praising whatsoever they assign and have ordained. So what I really like about this sentence, that it connects two things. One, this sort of larger divine order, but also that if you understand this divine order, then you are going to have the capacity to understand and have a good relationship with yourself. And then also that allows you to live harmoniously with others, and then harmoniously with the cosmos. And then from the last passage, there is only one phrase that I would like to look at, and that is in, so this is now book 8, section 48, where there is a phrase called a citadel of refuge. And so this sort of self, this what he calls here the understanding free from passions, is the self that is become sort of protective, right? So if you can be so indifferent to things, then nothing bad can ever happen to you. In short, I give you here a little chart to sort of compare Epicureanism if you sort of want to think more about it. But what's most important is that there is a lot of emphasis on rational constancy in accord with nature. And this idea of a sort of moderate fatalism is that some things we cannot control and we just have to adjust our desires. So this is not exactly a conquest philosophy. And when you get the emperor of the Roman world saying business of life is more akin to wrestling than dancing, for it requires us to stand ready and unshakable against every assault, however unforeseen, you can get a sense of how that citadel, you know, that citadel of refuge becomes like a really governing idea that sort of shapes the feeling of this period. So what matters to us about this is that this is the philosophical thinking that pervades the Roman Empire in this period. And it gives us a sense of almost like a preparation, if you wish, for the rough times to come, because the rough times to come, even though times are still good when Marcus writes this, but he has this fear that bad times are coming. And so that gives us a sense of sort of trying to prepare for that. Of course, when the rough times are coming, the emperors will stop being Stoic philosophers, but that's where we pick up the story in the next lecture.